Hello, how are you? I hope you're good. And today I am here to actually talk about a book on my booktube channel. And that book is this book. So this is the first book that I read in July, and also the book that I read for the Jane Austen July Readathon, and also the only book that I read for the Jane Austen July Readathon, and also the only book that I've read so far in July. So there's a lot riding on this book. You may have already heard me talk about the basic synopsis of The Other Bennet Sister on my TBR for July already, but just in case you missed that, I will clarify it again here. So The Other Bennet Sister is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, except instead of focusing on Lizzie Bennet, it focuses on one of Lizzie Bennet's younger sisters, Mary Bennet. And Mary Bennet is the introverted, unattractive nerd sister who's very intelligent. She's kind of the only sister in Pride and Prejudice who never really gets a happy ending or like any story whatsoever. She's only there for sort of comedic relief and for other characters to laugh at her. So this book takes her and gives her a story of her own and explores the idea of what it must be like to be the plain introverted sister in a world where looks are very important and your most of your prospects rely on you being attractive to men so that you can get a husband and therefore be looked after for the rest of your life. So that's the general gist of this book in a nutshell. But let's actually talk about what I thought of this book. As you guys all know, I separate my reviews into 5 parts for the 5 sort of categories of a book that I think about when I'm thinking about how much I liked it. Setting, plot, characters, themes, and writing. So first up, we'll talk about the setting. The setting for this book obviously wasn't anything particularly new or that other authors hadn't done because it is set in Jane Austen times and also in the same places where where Pride and Prejudice is set. So we're talking about basically just Regency England, but it was beautiful. And honestly, I spent so long after finishing this book just Googling all of the places that were mentioned and described so that I could just stare at pictures of them and imagine myself going there. And it absolutely reignited my deep need to go to England, which I can't do anytime soon. One of my favorite things about the setting of this book is that it actually intertwined with some of the themes that I'll talk about later on. But one of the major sort of things that happens in this book is they talk about the poet Wordsworth and all of the places where Wordsworth has been, and they sort of go on a little theme trip to some of the places that Wordsworth wrote about in his poems and they explore them. So it's sort of like this double layer of like looking at places that are related to Jane Austen and also looking at places that were related to William Wordsworth, and that was really lovely. And I learned a lot about him and the places that he's been and the places that he wrote about that I didn't know before as well. And now I have even more places on my list of literary destinations that I want to visit but can't. So thank you, The Other Bennet Sister, for making my to-visit list even longer and more unrealistic than it already was. Next up, let's talk about the plot. So the plot for this story, for the first part, it followed essentially just the arc of Pride and Prejudice. So it sort of started off with all of the Bennet sisters as children. It went through the events of Pride and Prejudice, but obviously told from Mary's point of view. But that was only the first part of the book, and then there were 3 more parts after that, and those 3 parts basically covered the events after Pride and Prejudice ends and finally actually follow Mary's story. So I thought that was really sweet. I like the fact that it played an ode to Pride and Prejudice and then continued on to become its own story. Each of the parts in the story had their own sort of mini arc where Mary Bennet, the main character, would sort of latch onto this idea of something that would turn her life around or bring her happiness and a sense of fulfillment, and she'd be working towards that goal, and then it would reach a climax for that particular part of her life and that particular goal, and then the next part would begin. So each of them sort of had their own little mini arc and their mini story, which made for a really well-paced story. I guess the only other thing I can really say about the plot is I really appreciated the fact that the climaxes for all of these mini sort of plots that were happening were very Austenian in their drama. It was all, you know, building up to someone going for a walk in the rain and then getting a chill. Like, all of that stuff is still there. So it was really nice to see that just because we have more I don't know, more dramatic things that we could have thrown into plots that we write nowadays, Janice Hadlow really stuck to the original Jane Austen sort of ideas of what caused drama in society. It was a nice nostalgia to sort of slip into this world where the only thing that they care about is whether or not so-and-so went for a walk in the rain, and so that was really lovely. The characters obviously were just the Jane Austen characters. Personally, I felt that they were better written than a lot of at least the characters in in Pride and Prejudice. I think that Janice Hudlow did a really admirable job of writing Mary Bennet, and I think she took this character that was just this two-dimensional comedic character who was only there for people to sort of laugh at her and not really care about her, and she took that character and she made her someone thoughtful and original and well-rounded, and someone that I think Jane Austen would have been proud of. Honestly, I like to think that Jane Austen might almost have been ashamed of herself for not having written Mary this way in the first place, because Mary was a truly lovely character, and she was independent and she was fierce and she was thoughtful and intelligent and just lots of things that we sort of take pride in Lizzie Bennet for being, but obviously living under Lizzie Bennet's shadow. So it was really lovely to read that. All of the other characters also sort of stood true to their own characterization in the original book, but obviously viewed through the lens of Mary Bennet's eyes. One thing that I will say about this book is that it made me hate Mr. Bennet with a newfound and newly kindled passion. I already didn't like Mr. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. I've always thought that he was a pretty, I don't know, just a shit character. He's not good. He you know, he's there and he's married this person that he's decided is beneath him in intelligence and in common sense, and instead of being in any way a decent person about it, he just sits there making jokes at their expense and taking pleasure in the fact that they aren't intelligent enough to pick up on the fact that they're being mocked. And he continues to do that in this book as well. And then there's just the added insult to the fact that he only cares about Lizzie Bennet. He doesn't care about any of the rest of the daughters. And there's this other daughter there who is just as witty and intelligent as Lizzie Bennet, but just uninteresting to him because he just believes that everyone is beneath him except for Lizzie Bennet. It just added a remarkable amount of fuel to the fire that is my rage when it comes to Mr. Bennet. That sentence didn't make any sense, but we're going to ignore that. Gosh, look at me go. I'm getting through this in a way that I did not expect myself to. The writing was also super lovely. One of my favorite things about the writing in this book is that she made reference to a lot of Jane Austen books, like not just Pride and Prejudice, but there were some quotes and some references in here from Persuasion and from Emma as well. And they're always really cleverly done and sort of interwoven into people's dialogue. People will say things that are actually quotes from other books and stuff like that. And I felt like that it was very intricately done, and it really immersed you into this feeling that you were writing a book that might very well have been written by Jane Austen. Like the writing style mirrored hers very well. It paid a really nice homage to Austen's writing while still being a well-written book in its own right as well. If you struggle to read Jane Austen, I think this would be a good book to start to sort of get you into the idea of what Jane Austen is all about while still being very readable and very easy to pick up and get through. And then finally, just ever so briefly, I will talk a little bit about some of the themes that I found when reading this novel that made me think and reflect after having finished it. The main one that they sort of talk about in this particular book is the balance between being sort of logical and rational and between being passionate. And that's sort of like the whole story from beginning to end is Mary's struggle with trying to decide how much she should give over to her feelings and allow herself to sort of follow her gut and her heart rather than following her mind, and to only do things based on logic and based on what seems to be the most pragmatic action to take. One of the big points that also gets made in this book is the concept that it can be hard for other people to love you if you haven't already begun to love yourself. If you don't love anything about yourself, why would there be any reason for someone else to find something to love in you? Sounds a bit silly, but you get the idea. So that's one of the other big sort of points or themes that also gets explored in this book. And then finally, like I said earlier, they talk a lot about Wordsworth. In her reading, she reads primarily sort of two genres. She spends most of the book reading non-fiction when she's trying to be logical, and then someone introduces her to poetry, and the poetry is the stand-in for the feelings and the passion and the fire. And so then between reading the non-fiction books and reading poetry books, she sort of learns these ideas and these concepts about how to balance your pragmatism with your passion. And like I said, she and some of the main characters in this book, they go on a little trip to I wish I could remember the place. I'll just write it somewhere on the screen around me. But they go on a little holiday and they walk around the lake and up the mountain that features in a lot of Wordsworth's letters and also in his poems. And apparently he also wrote a guidebook about the area because that's how passionate he was about this particular area. So that was super nice as well. and made me want to read more Wordsworth. So all in all, in case you couldn't tell, I did absolutely adore this book. I thought that the characters, they did justice to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice while also being more well-rounded, particularly Mary. Obviously, it'd be a bit hard to write a book about a main character that was as two-dimensional as Jane Austen's Mary. The plot was also lovely. It is a romance book, so there's some romance and there are some lovely men, and Mary gets her happily ever after, which is also nice. So it's a very nice feel-good novel. It's lighthearted, it's feel-good, it was super easy to read. I chuckled a lot at some of the things that happened in this book, and also at the references. A lot of the references to other Jane Austen books are also very funnily done, and when you see them you'll have this little spark of joy. So it was a super lovely book. In my mind it was definitely a 5-star read, and I would strongly recommend it to anyone who is a fan of Jane Austen, who is thinking about getting into Jane Austen, like maybe you've only watched the movies but you've never read the books, or anyone who's just looking for a light-hearted, feel-good, distracting read in this crazy COVID time that we're living in. Strongly recommend this book because it will take you out of this world and into a world that is far simpler and far lovelier and far happier. Yeah, that's it. Good job me. I did a book review and I did it in a decent amount of time. This never happens. I will see you for another video very shortly, I'm sure, and until then, as always, stay classic.
Sit there and count your little fingers. Unhappy little girl blue.